Before we start, I just want to thank TheMoonRover for letting me use their playthrough footage for this video. All gameplay you'll see is theirs, and I've linked the full video in the descriptions and the card on screen. I really appreciate them letting me use their footage for this video. I'd also like to thank Mr. FO1 for making the documentary that inspired this video in the first place, as well as allowing me to use the information from it here. As some of you might know, if you've browsed my channel past the point where I started with my VHS horror analysis videos, I enjoy playing video games. And one of those games, which I've been doing a playthrough of on this channel and really ought to get around to finishing, is Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer, or at least a Reignited re-released version of it. And please don't comment telling me it's called Ripto's Rage. I'm well aware that was its title elsewhere, and even in the Reignited trilogy, but it releases Gateway to Glimmer in Europe originally, and I like that title a little better. Anyway, the Reignited trilogy is a complete upgrade and re-release of the original 3 Spyro games from the late 90s and early 2000s, which released on the PlayStation 1. I actually owned and completed all 3 as a child, even though I never 100%ed them. Except Gateway to Glimmer, but only once, and even that was an effort to achieve, I recall. But these 3 games shot Spyro into stardom back then. Spyro was one of the big mascots of the 90s. Some kids had Mario, others Zelda or Crash or Sonic, but my brother and I had Spyro. And Pokemon, but we're talking about the Purple Dragon here. So when the PlayStation 2 released and a new Spyro game was said to be coming to it, hopes were high. Sure, the original studio behind the games, Insomniac, had moved on to other series at the time, but that didn't mean we couldn't get a good Spyro game. After all, there'd been some good Spyro games on a handheld console after the third game, Year of the Dragon, was released, and neither of those games had been made by Insomniac. But when that game, Enter the Dragonfly, released, it wasn't what we expected. In fact, it really wasn't what we expected. My memories of playing it are vague at best, given that I've not touched it in years, but it was underwhelming, small, and it lacked that something that the other 3 games had had. And from it, I think spawned something that I consider the part of how I look at media to this day, because I didn't hate it. I just felt it could have been better, like potential had been wasted. Enter the Dragonfly always felt like it could have been more to me, like it deserved a chance to be done again, but properly this time. But I was just a young girl, one of many out there, and surely it was only me who would want to see that second chance given. So for years I left that thought to sit in the back of my mind, until I discovered a nearly 2-hour-long video on YouTube on the game and its development, and discovered that I was more right than I could ever have guessed. Not only was Enter the Dragonfly a Christmas rushed, but there were so many ideas for the game that just never got realised. Today, my friends, we're doing something a little different from my standard scripted fare. We're not analysing mysterious footage, poking through clues to try and piece together a story, no. Instead, I'm going to take that thought I had as a nearly teenager, add information from the documentary, and make a video on it. Let's talk about Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, touch on why it never got to live up to its potential, and why I think it deserves not only another chance to shine, but why it deserves a massive overhaul of its elements and story to include the things that should have been a part of the original game to begin with. Just as a quick aside, I'm not actually going to be considering much of anything beyond Enter the Dragonfly because I've never actually played them, so it wouldn't feel fair. So no Legends or Skylanders continuity here, and probably little to no mention of A Hero's Tale or Shadow Legacy either. Though I will be touching on them briefly, you'll find out why as I go. First, it might be a good idea for me to give you a little background, just so you understand the place the Spyro series was in when Enter the Dragonfly came onto the scene. At the time Enter the Dragonfly came out, Spyro was a PlayStation powerhouse. The original trilogy had released during the 90s to much positive critical reception. Spyro the Dragon, not the character but the first game, introduced us to the character of Spyro, his friend Sparx the Dragonfly, and had established the Dragon World, a series of magic-filled, interconnected worlds inhabited by all sorts of magical things and creatures. At least it was when Nasty Nork, the first game's major big bad, had cast his spell to turn the dragon's gem sentient. Gateway to Glimmer, or Ripto's Rage if you lived outside of Europe, was the second game and introduced a lot of the elements that then became the standard. Spyro's 90s mascot attitude was softened, the flammable containers of gems changed from red chests to baskets, while the chargeable ones were still metal chests. Zoe the Fairy and her many identical clones would autosave the game when you passed by them. Other worlds outside of the Dragon Worlds were introduced, Ripto himself who would become somewhat of a recurring villain to Spyro, and of course Hunter the Cheetah who became Spyro's other best friend besides Sparx. The second game was a little bit of an oddity, with enemies dropping spirit particles to activate power-up gates instead of dropping gems, but since Avalar was a different world, that can kind of be hand-waved. Year of the Dragon was the third game, and my personal favourite as a child. Although it was also Christmas rushed, it was still a very good game, with any noticeable bugs being mainly contained in some funky amusement placement which had the wrong tracks playing in certain levels, including Enchanted Towers having Sergeant Bird's theme playing for the entire level instead of the level's actual theme, which only played during the mini-quest side areas, something that was actually turned into a bit of a extended glitch in Reignited by giving that level a remix of Sergeant Bird's theme which fitted with the level's aesthetic, while still remixing the original theme in the side areas. Year of the Dragon introduced us to the idea that the dragon worlds were larger than we the players, or even some of the dragons knew. The Forgotten Realms were also technically part of the same world as the dragon worlds, but dragons had left mysteriously many years ago and had seemingly taken the magic with them. Year of the Dragon gave us 4 new characters to play as in certain levels and sub-levels, which spiced up gameplay to some mixed but mainly positive reactions, as well as 2 villains much more interesting than either Natty Nork or Ripto. The Sorceress was a threatening matriarch in charge of the Forgotten Realms and was served by her right-hand rabbit, Bianca, who you quickly realise is a bit less of a threat than her mentor, and eventually see is not as cut out to play the villain as the Sorceress. It dealt with some themes later in the story that, while not focused on that heavily, were certainly a step up in maturity for the series at the time. The game deals with child kidnap, light blackmail later on, and ultimately potential murder in the service of a very selfish goal. I'm being vague about that because there still might even be someone out there who'd like to experience the game for the first time, and I do my best not to do spoilers. But from this, I hope you can see why Enter the Dragonfly had a lot to live up to. As I mentioned before, there were also a couple of games on the Game Boy Advance, but since I never got to play either of them, I'm not going to focus too heavily on them here because I don't have the experience of their story or play style. But then the new technology of the PlayStation 2 was announced, and like many mascots of the PlayStation 1 era, Spyro was going to make that jump to the new console, with the game being started shortly after Year of the Dragon was out. This is where that nearly 2-hour long video comes in again. That video was a documentary on the making of Enter the Dragonfly, with interviews and quotes from people who had been involved in working on the game. It was posted to a channel called Mr. FO1, researched by 2 people, and there were even 2 more update videos with even more information posted afterwards. They very kindly allowed me to use their videos as reference, but I'll be summing it up much more briefly than they have. If you want to hear the full story, please go watch their videos linked in the description down below. It's a fascinating story. They've also got a massive collection of beta elements that they show off in other videos, which just from a quick look gives you some idea of how much was tweaked and even just completely scrapped before launch. There were 3 companies involved in Enter the Dragonfly: Universal Vivendi as the publisher, while Check 6 Games and Equinox Digital Entertainment were co-developers. Check 6 apparently did a lot of the programming of the game, while Equinox was working on the visual elements, and Universal seemed to be overseeing the entire thing. However, ideas that the developers seemed to be having for the game were often shot down by Universal, even if those ideas had already entered some kind of development or had been originally asked for by someone at Universal, which ultimately led to problems when Universal then wanted Enter the Dragonfly out for the holiday season of 2002, and there really wasn't that much of a game to ship. Besides the lack of more than one hub world and only a handful of the planned levels ever making it onto the disc, the game is notorious for its bugs. You can look on YouTube now and you'll most likely find plenty of videos of people clipping through walls and floors and falling out of levels, game sprites doing all kinds of weird and funky things, and a variety of other lovely glitches. Heck, if you can activate the swimming in the air bug, which admittedly was in some of the previous console games too, you were able to get to the final boss from the start of the game. You'd only get a little part of the fight though, because you had to collect over a certain amount of the game's main collectibles in order to access the second and then third stages of the boss battle. Which sounds like a cool idea in theory, but apparently left you with no ending at all other than a straight cut to the ending credits unless you collected enough to trigger stage 3. I say apparently because I never finished this game. I can't recall whether it was down to a lack of interest though, or if we encountered a game-breaking bug that stopped us from making it any further. I suspect it might have been the latter, but my admittedly very vague recollections of playing the game are surprisingly free of any of the bugs most people encountered. Although I do remember being left behind by the floating stone that took you to Dragonfly Dojo a lot, that one was just kind of funny to us though. My main gripe about the game though will forever be its fairly weak story. Not that the previous 3 games had strong stories either, but Enter the Dragonfly really doesn't do well here. The game starts at this event where the baby dragons that were saved in the Year of the Dragon are about to receive their own dragonflies, similar to how Spyro had Sparks by his side. Now suddenly Ripto and his 2 goons, Crash and Gulp, show up, and instead of attacking him or being on the defensive, Spyro just stands there and asks what Ripto wants. Then Ripto, who had been established to be a powerful magic user in the second game, uses a spell to abduct all the baby dragonflies and Sparks too, only it goes wrong somehow. And the cutscene where he discovers it went wrong doesn't play until you're already partway through the game. And I don't mean after you've run about the hub world for a bit and jumped into the first world portal, or even after finishing the first world. No, I mean after you've already visited and maybe even finished half the worlds you can visit. And the thing is, Ripto goes on and on about how stealing the dragonflies will make the dragons helpless, but it's never elaborated why this is in the game. We're never told what purpose the dragonflies play for the dragon's well-being or strength, and that's infuriating. Although I know that one of the GBA games, Season of Fire, said they were necessary for dragon fire breath, but it still left dragons with icy breath instead, which is far from helpless, and I'm honestly not sure how canonical it is to the original canon. Just the level of threat established in the last 3 games isn't set up here. The first game? All the dragons are stuck in crystal and the gems turned into monsters. Nasty Nork has hijacked this world. You're the only dragon left and you're much smaller than the rest of the dragons, although still capable. The second game? A tyrant has arrived and is trying to take control of Avalar, though he hasn't quite succeeded yet. The third game? An entire new generation of young dragons has been kidnapped away by a self-obsessed and selfish new villain who controls a realm the dragons aren't familiar with. Here? The dragonflies have been scattered around the same worlds that the dragons live in, and although this apparently makes the dragons weaker, we never get to see what dragonfly deprivation looks like for a dragon, so we have less sense of urgency. And no one ever really stresses to Spyro to hurry up and find the dragonflies either. I remember the final boss I mentioned earlier? That's the only big boss battle this game has. And I mentioned that it can have up to 3 stages, so with Ripto, Crush and Gulp, you'd expect each stage would involve you fighting each one in turn maybe. Nope, it's all against Ripto fighting you in different ways, and Crush and Gulp don't appear again after that cutscene where Ripto realises the spell went wrong halfway through the game. And since we last see them being blasted back by a spell from Ripto, some people wonder if Ripto just did them in then and there in anger. I personally don't think so, but if so, where did they go? In the second game, Ripto is only fought after you've defeated both Crush and Gulp, and pretty much does all he can to not fight you directly until he has no choice. I was also never very fond of the entire runes thing, although I think that's mainly because I found the dragon spirit statue to be utterly ridiculous with how much it moved about but only back and forth in the same way, and immediately snapped back upright when you proceeded no matter where he was in that animation. The dragon spirit statue never ever felt like a character to me, it was just a plot convenience, and I wish it had been done better or even had some extra dialogue to give it more meaning or effect. The runes were also great chunks of rock and they just looked clunky to me, although whether the short game affected how I felt about them I can't know. Honestly, it sounds like I really dislike the game, and I don't. As I said, even as a child I knew that this game had amazing potential. The level designs are amazing, the platforming was just as I remember it being in the previous 3 console games, and honestly some of the residents of those levels were my favourites. I mean, look at these sleepy little teddy bears, they're adorable. I also loved how the thieves we'd met in previous games were suddenly residents of their own world now, and how we could go to their den as one of the worlds. It just suggested to me that rather than being malicious or evil, they were just a race of chaotic neutral imps who enjoyed taking things, taunting you and then leading you on a merry chase. I also always remember the one outside the level telling you that you needed to steal more dragonflies to access the level. And again, that just suggested to me that taking things from people and running with them was just how they functioned, and somehow they thought that everyone else also functioned that way. They were never bad, it was just a bit of a game to them, a challenge. Probably reading too much into that, but that could have been some awesome world building for the Dragon Realms there. I also enjoyed the ways they tried to mix up the level entry pass, although I'm very fond of the traditional portal gates. I never quite understood why Cloud9's whirlwind just forced you up into the balloon-like structure above it. Could they not have made it taller, or had Spyro shrink to make it look like he was going inside? But also, the music for the game was top class again. The base for greatness was there, but this game, like so many others before and after, fell victim to the dreaded troubled development and a bunch of executive meddling. During the course of the documentary, many people who worked on the game were interviewed, and most mentioned that the problems started with disagreements between the people that made up the three individual groups of Check 6, Equinox and Universal, which led to a poor working environment. Certain key people were said to be difficult to work with, and as mentioned before, Universal had a habit of rejecting ideas while they were being worked upon. I'm not actually going to mention names here because it's irrelevant for the video, but again, it's all in the documentary videos if you want to find out a little bit more. Just keep in mind, as always, where the source of information in this video comes from, and that because of that there will be some bias. I'll be presenting the information though, assuming that it's mostly truthful, if a little weighted in the favour of one particular side. Enter the Dragonfly actually had a sizable number of levels planned for it, with 4 hub worlds themed around weather, and about 25 actual levels being advertised. But the problems behind the scenes were not only half-done assets having to be scrapped, but also the work environment, which led to people leaving the team before the game was completed, led to the scope of the project having to be cut way down to what we got in the end, with some people involved with the development estimating about 80% of the content they made ended up cut or just scrapped entirely. The most infamous of these missing levels is one called Enchanted Forest, which actually has code for parts of it still on the game disc. Dialogue exists in this code for the main part of the level, but not the sub-level mini-quests, and there were a handful of unused tracks that could be found on the soundtrack that came with a special release edition of Enter the Dragonfly, which are often suspected to be not only Enchanted Forest's main level theme, but also the themes for 2 sub-level quest areas that would have existed. We also know that the level would have appeared as platforms constructed between and around massive redwood-like trees, possibly similar to treetops from the first Spyro game, but hopefully a lot less of a pain to navigate around, and they would have been inhabited by a race of Scottish porcupines. Other missing levels would have included Cutthroat Cove, which would have been a town built of discarded and broken pirate ships populated by Viking iguanas, and Baked Alaska, which would have been a tundra-like environment which had become a desert, populated by gem mining penguins, although at first it could have been a standard ice world where Bentley the Yeti could have made an appearance. It seems these 3 out of the numerous other scrapped levels actually got the closest to being implemented before being dropped, and some elements still remain, such as references in the code and a special locked chest for each level that was moved to somewhere else in the game after those levels were removed. There were also changes made to some levels' fundamental ideas, such as the Thieves' Den level originally planned to be flipped upside down by the Riptop wizards invading it, although that might have caused the level to be frustrating to control through, so that might have been why it got cut, although it's still a really cool idea. There were also apparently plans to bring back a few Sparks solo mini-stages like the ones that had appeared in Year of the Dragon, although details were scarce and recollections from developers of one of those stages were just vague memories of shooting lightning and the grass texture of the floor. The same person also recalls that there were plans to introduce a new character into the game, a dragon called Ember, someone who eventually ended up debuting in A Hero's Tale instead because, like many other things, she ended up as cut content when they couldn't find a way to properly insert her into the game's story. There were also plans for the Professor to construct vehicles for side quests once you found the parts for him to make the vehicle with. There was also some missing music, with Mr. FO1 managing to track down some of the composers who worked on the game, who gave him copies of the master discs of tracks, with over 14 of those completely unused in the game. Other things that were changed or removed can easily be seen in beta screenshots or footage, which include things like different enemy death animations, specific particle effects for when a dragonfly was captured based on its colour, seemingly, geometry changes to a level, and the removal of an entire secondary returning villain. Originally, Ripto wasn't set to be the only antagonist returning to fight with Spyro in this game. Nasty Nork was also supposed to be making a return and teaming up with Ripto to take the dragonflies. However, again, as the game was being pushed to be completed and out before Christmas 2002, Nasty unfortunately got cut out, although amusingly Mr. FO1 points out that they still used his sprite but retextured for statues in the game. However, the story we got in the end with Ripto abducting the dragonflies to somehow weaken the dragons isn't the one we were originally going to be presented with either. Originally, there were 2 other ideas for antagonistic forces to be faced off with in Enter the Dragonfly. One of these was the idea for a race of creatures known as Groblins, whose leader would become a dragon themselves as the final boss, and the other was for there to be an evil dragon that Spyro needed to go up against. The last one in particular though was nixed by the lead designer for the game because apparently there are no evil dragons. Yeah, you can see that changed pretty quickly afterwards, huh? Another piece of interesting information as far as the story went is that originally Check 6 was set to continue the growth of Spyro's story into more mature topics to reflect the audience of the games also slowly growing up. The first game had been light-hearted, sure, questions about an entire species being entrapped in crystal and world domination aside, but Gateway to Glimmer also dealt with the idea of a world being taken over, but was given a little more focus this time, and the antagonist made into a tyrant. And the third game, Year of the Dragon, involves a depiction of a very toxic relationship between Bianca and her mentor and possible pseudo-parental figure, the Sorceress. It also involved topics such as light blackmail through the use of a hostage, and the Sorceress's true intentions for the baby dragons itself is very dark, even if it's given very little focus after we find out about it. The path had been set for Check 6 by Insomniac, and they wanted to follow it. But again, Universal stepped in and made sure the game was more kid-focused than had been intended. So as you can see, a lot of Enter the Dragonfly's value seems tied up more in what we never got to see. Although that obviously might be down to it being more vague and ill-defined, and thus more open to us interpreting it in whatever way we personally would like to see. And I think that if Enter the Dragonfly ever did get its own remake, a lot of this previously lost value should be restored into the game to finally realise that vision that was originally had for the game. So, with that said, what do I think a potential Enter the Dragonfly Reignited would look like? Well, firstly we're going to tweak the story, but not completely throw out what we already have. Universal wanted a returning villain, so let's keep Ripto in there. Nasty unfortunately still gets left out though, I can't really find a way to squeeze him in too. The story still takes place around the time of the Dragonfly Festival, but it's made clearer this time that young dragons receive dragonflies to help them control and grow into their magic as they age. To this end, all the adult dragons too have dragonflies still, but their relationship is no longer as symbiotic as it is with the young dragons. The reason dragonflies and dragons have this relationship is that dragonflies are able to merge their own innate magics with that of a young dragon, and so the two forever have this magical link that allows for control for a young dragon, and so even as adults the dragonfly will always have some ties to their dragon and their magic. And it is for this reason dragonflies are targeted, for breaking the bond weakens even the adult dragon. The plot basically sees Ripto, after his defeat in Avalar, coming across the story of a dragon elder who grew to crave all the magic of the dragon worlds and so was sealed away in a hidden location. He finds this location and using his own powers breaks the seal. He then uses another spell to bind this dragon elder to his will and decides that he will use this evil elder's powers to defeat Spyro. But the elder's powers seem to have diminished in his imprisonment, and so he tells Ripto that if he had access to the dragonflies he would be able to regain them. So Ripto and this bound elder show up at the festival and attempt to trap all the dragonflies, taking everyone by surprise and nearly succeeding. But the other dragon elders use an emergency spell that is meant to take the dragonflies somewhere safe, but thanks to Ripto's strong magical ability is only able to instead scatter the dragonflies around the dragon worlds, weakening the dragons in the process but keeping them out of the hands of both Ripto and the evil elder. This in turn would also awaken the dragon spirit, a being who only comes awake when the dragons are in great peril of losing their magic, which is why they never awoke when Nasty Nork turned them all to crystal. They technically didn't lose their magic in that case. The spirit then releases some sacred runes hidden about the land for Spyro to find and bring back for the different elemental breath weapons. Again, an emergency means put in place to let one specific dragon have options in stopping whatever disaster is depriving dragons of their magic. Heck, we could even give it a little backstory in that the dragon spirit is all that remains of the leader of the original group of dragon elders who sealed away this one evil elder. However, about halfway through the game, we discover that the evil elder was lying about his powers having diminished and instead is using Ripto and his minions to boost his own abilities to free himself of the sorcerer's control, so he can once again try to hoard all the magic of the world for himself. And with enough dragonflies, he can draw on the magics of the other dragons to cast his spell to suck the world dry of magic and keep it to himself. And without magic to keep it alive, it's hinted that many different creatures will simply cease to exist, among them the other dragons. Even those who don't require magic to survive will be reduced to a hard life, having to serve this one evil elder with no magic of their own. So eventually Ripto and Spyro have to form a temporary enemy mind pact to defeat this evil elder and reseal him back up for good. There could even be a triple stage boss battle with Crush, Gulp and then Ripto each in turn playing some active ally parts to fight against the Evil Elder alongside Spyro. And since I'd like Crush and Gulp to be a part of this game too, make it clear that Ripto's revived them with magic. Said magic could even be responsible for them having voices, which, again, they didn't have in the second game and suddenly acquired for this game. Also, give Hunter and Bianca more to do, these two were popular characters for a reason. Moneybags though, well, he canonically retired, so honestly he has little reason to show up. And he only appears once in the game as it is, so no big loss. On the topic of the memes of Ripto though, while I have nothing against the Riptocs, let's be honest, they are just Rhinox from the third game redone, and later Spyro games even had Ripto using the Rhinox instead. Why not use that Groblin's idea instead and make them the minions of Ripto? You could even include their leader stealing some of the dragon magic and getting drunk off it and being the boss at the end of one of the hub worlds. We could even have a Groblin's world as a stage, access to a portal to another world like Avalar, giving them an origin point. Speaking of worlds, we used some of the dragon worlds from the first game and areas of the Forgotten Realms from the third, only Spyro is visiting parts he has been through before and a few areas he didn't previously. Maybe during the time between that game and this one, inhabitants from the Forgotten Realms have moved back to the Dragon Worlds and made their own areas, or certain dragons have set up shop in the Forgotten Realms and are a point of call for Spyro to find the Dragonfly/rune in that area. But always, Spyro's main goal of the level is to do something to help stop the draining of magic that the loss of the Dragonflies has caused. Although a few less related tasks like the Dragonfly Dojo one would still work, and I kind of have a soft spot for Luau Island's dilemma, so a few worlds having issues not related to the current happenings could also still be around. I still want that thief level to be kept though, because as I said before, I loved everything about what the existence of such a place hinted at for the world building it did. But my main point is that I'd love to see it actually said that since the defeat of the Sorceress, that both the Dragon Worlds and Forgotten Realms have become unified, and its peoples now live in both areas. I'd love to actually see that world building, because in the game we got, they're just sort of there, having not been there really in the first game, although that's probably down to limitations, or more realistically having not planned that far ahead story wise. Also, certain worlds can't be accessed until the magic is more stable, similar to how Dragon Egg magic was used to restore portals in the Forgotten Realms. It's something that was already established, so it makes sense to do it that way. As far as mini-games and side quests, you could probably keep those the same as they were in the original game, but for those magical gate/challenge portal tasks, have Sparks or someone else tell Spyro that it is the fault of Ripto's minions that the Dragonflies are there. Like, make it clear that they've been trapped there until they can either be collected, or somehow these gates are being used to siphon the magic from them to aid in the schemes of the villains. Just give them more of an excuse to exist than, oh hey, here's this random magical gate and it happens to have a dragonfly inside it. Tell us how and why. Oh, and change the dialogue box when the first one is encountered to remove Spyro being clueless about how to activate it. He's done similar tasks before. Just have Sparks comment something like, step through the gate and complete the challenge to break the seal and release the dragonfly or something. Have the task givers be both those inhabitants of the world and other random dragons, including the babies. Because if I recall, there were only a few side quests in Enter the Dragonfly that involved the young dragons you spent all that time saving in Year of the Dragon. Let them live in the world you brought them back to. Have some non-interactable ones at least wandering around the first hub world. Also, Hunter can be a task giver just as he is in the game, but so can Bianca. I think that would be a good way to give her more involvement. And one other thing, subtitle all of Sparks' dialogue, even in the cutscenes. It's not always possible to tell what he's buzzing without them, and that's just kind of annoying. Enter the Dragonfly was a complete nightmare for most involved in it. It was released to mixed reviews and has gone down in history as a very broken game that disappointed so many. What's worse is that the developers had already spent part of the end of the development cycle not receiving their regular paychecks, and the failure of the game took down both Check 6 and Equinox in its wake, forcing the people still employed by them to find new work, having possibly already eaten into any savings they'd had as a result of missing paychecks before. Noticeably, when watching Mr. FO1's documentary videos on the game, the people he interviews all mention in some way that their memories of the time are not comfortable ones, and that any interviews forgotten at all I feel is amazing. I thank all those who allowed themselves to be interviewed and have their worlds included in those videos, because I know it isn't easy to talk about a past that hurts you. But now a much wider audience knows the truth of Enter the Dragonfly, or at least a part of it. Spyro's first PlayStation 2 outing was strangled all the way along, and confused plans, an unhealthy working environment between three companies, and a desire to keep Spyro child-friendly all seem to have contributed to something with potential never being allowed to live up to it. But this is 2022. The Spyro Reignited trilogy released a few years back to positive reception, and Spyro's fellow PlayStation 1 mascot Crash Bandicoot's original 3 games got that remake treatment too, and a new 4th game to boot. With the right direction and passion, good remakes can happen. Maybe there's still a chance for that unreleased potential of Enter the Dragonfly to shine through, and for those of us who received a disappointing PS2 game back in 2002/2003 to finally get the new Spyro adventure we've been waiting for. And maybe that new Enter the Dragonfly will contain a few of the things I've mentioned I'd personally love to see if it did happen. And maybe I'm really not the only person who'd like to see it happen. Maybe. Remember, this is only my idea of what I think a reignited Enter the Dragonfly would look like. What about you? Tell me your ideas in the comments below.